This is the GitButler website, which you can find at gitbutler.com. I quite like this website because it brings a few associations to mind. I'm going to talk about those, but I should say that I don't know if those are the associations that the designers intended, so it's a very personal set of associations, but I would not be surprised if that's what they were aiming at. So the first thing to point out is that there's this quite simple sort of black, white and teal color scheme used throughout the site. And I'll point out the ways that that's used quite cleverly, throughout. The second one is that I like the combination of typefaces here. So they've got a sort of monospace serif typeface, which is a reference, I assume, to code and terminals. So that fits the brand quite well. But then they've got this sort of editorial serif. And I don't know if this is Garamond, but it reminds me of Garamond, which for a long time was the marketing typeface used by Apple for their adverts, for their hardware. So if they advertise, for example, the Macintosh, they might use this sort of condensed Garamond to advertise it. And so even though this editorial typeface, which you might associate with newspapers, for example, doesn't seem to immediately be associated with things like code, as you'd expect for a Git product. It's actually sort of going back to history and saying that this editorial typeface or editorial serif typeface was associated with computing in the early days, which fits the theme of this website really well. I really like this group of actions here. So they've fit a lot into a small space and they've made it relatively clear. So you've got a download button, a drop down. It's telling you exactly what you're downloading and what it's suitable for. A view source button and this watch a YouTube video button, which animates or starts playing once you hover over it. So there's a lot packed in here, giving you a lot of choice, and it feels quite neat and orderly. It doesn't feel like I'm being overwhelmed with choices there. If you look to the right here, there's a illustration, and this website is full of illustrations and animations that I think probably took a long time. These are harder to get right than it might seem, just from looking at it and thinking, oh, it's a video. But you can see behind here, it's got this drop shadow effect, but it's using this kind of dithering effect to show the drop shadow. So there are these lots of little dots rather than a solid color, or a repeating pattern. And again, this calls back to an early sort of era of computing where dithering was used as a way to shade areas before sort of graphics had advanced enough, especially in things like newspapers. You would see dithering to render images. So again, this calls back to the same sort of editorial advertising era as the typeface, and it's quite nice when a website uses two different visual styles or visual techniques, in this case the editorial serif typeface and the dithering, to call back to the same kind of era. It really puts that era of computing in mind for you and gives you a very coherent sense of the brand. Oh, I will also say that this teal, I'm not sure if this is intentional at all, reminds me of the teal background used for Windows 95. So I assume some of you were alive when Windows 95 was in its heyday. And when you'd load it up, often there'd be this default teal background, probably to counteract all of the grays, which you can also see here on the website, right? It's grey and teal. That calls back to this Windows 95 era of computing. So they're really pushing this idea of a different time quite hard. Each of these illustrations, some of these are custom illustrations, they're quite abstract. I'm not hovering over one yet, because it changes when I hover over it. But you can see here they're using these abstract illustrations to illustrate a specific concept. And so this one below my mouse is showing something being dragged from left to right. If I hover over it, a video starts playing and they're showing the act of dragging things between boxes. So that's quite a nice way of showing the abstract concept that you're about to see. When you hover over it, you're seeing how that concept works in practice. And I don't know if it's worth the effort to do this, but I quite like that they took the time to show a simpler version which helps you to recognize what the topic is, dragging and dropping. And then they're showing you a more complex version, which if you just saw this as a still image, you might not realize what it was focused on, and if it was immediately playing as a video, it might distract you or be too much because all three of them would be playing. So that's a nice sort of halfway house I quite like. Also, once you hover over it, you see that it moves up to the left and to the top, and you get again this dithering drop shadow effect around the bottom. As I scroll down here, you can see this FAQ. This is quite a common pattern where you have an FAQ section and these expandable sections that you can click on to expand. What I like here is that they've kept that dithering approach, but they've used a different pattern for the background of each of these. And I assume that all of these are patterns you might have found at some point. But regardless of that, it's quite nice just because it helps each question to stand out without being too obvious, or if they used a very colorful pattern or something, that might distract you from the questions. Here they've got this black and white dithering pattern. They're all background patterns and textures. But they make each question feel slightly different. So if you're working through the questions, that probably subtly helps you to sort of move on to the next one. And the last thing here is that you can see they basically took the same sort of layout as in the hero section up here. But now, because the background of the call to action container here is teal, they've made all of this white. So that's quite a nice reversal of this pattern working with a different background. I also quite like that instead of having the call to action full width and then the footer below, which is the very standard sort of website layout pattern, they've combined them. So they've got quite a short footer, and they've realized that they can put both the call to action and the footer side by side and rely on the teal background here to help the call to action stand out.